"You're not flying anywhere today." The words cracked across the terminal like a judge's gavel, loud enough to turn heads from the coffee stand, the boarding area, and even the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. Richard Coleman stood rigid in his airport security uniform, one hand resting on a tablet, the other pointing toward the exit corridor as if the decision had already been made. Across from him stood Danielle Brooks, a 42-year-old black woman wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple charcoal sweater. No luxury handbag, no designer logo, no entourage. Nothing about her appearance matched the assumptions already forming in Richard's mind. The VIP departure lounge around them had been quiet moments earlier, filled with business travelers scrolling through emails and families waiting for evening flights. Now the air felt different. Charged, curious, uncomfortable. Danielle didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with the calm expression of someone who had heard those words before. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe." These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Danielle Brooks. Richard took another step forward. "Your identification needs additional verification," he said, though his tone sounded less like procedure and more like accusation. Danielle had already shown her credentials twice. She had already answered every question. Yet somehow the process kept restarting. Around them, travelers exchanged glances. A man in a navy blazer lowered his newspaper. A woman near the charging station quietly removed one earbud. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. Danielle folded her hands loosely in front of her. "Is there a problem with my documents?" she asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "The problem is that your travel arrangements don't add up." The words lingered in the air. Danielle noticed the young airport employee standing several feet away. Her name tag read Emily Carter. Emily looked uneasy, as though she wanted to say something but wasn't sure whether she should. Danielle had seen that look before too. 20 years earlier, she had stood in another airport wearing a second-hand blazer, carrying a single suitcase, listening as an airline employee questioned whether she belonged in the priority line. Back then she had no company, no influence, and barely enough money for the ticket in her hand. The memory flashed through her mind and disappeared just as quickly. She returned her attention to Richard. "I'm expected on the other side of that gate," she said evenly. Richard laughed once under his breath. "Not today." The lounge grew quieter. Even the announcements echoing from distant terminals seemed farther away. Danielle glanced toward the massive windows overlooking the runway. Outside, dusk painted the horizon in shades of gold and blue. Somewhere beyond those lights, engines hummed in the distance. Faint, steady, approaching. Richard continued speaking, convinced he controlled the room. But Danielle's eyes remained fixed on the runway. A subtle smile touched the corner of her mouth. Nobody noticed it. Not Richard. Not the passengers. Not even Emily. Yet something was changing. And somewhere beyond the glass, a growing roar began to roll across the evening sky. The distant roar beyond the glass continued to grow, but inside the VIP departure lounge nobody paid attention to it yet. Their attention remained fixed on Danielle Brooks. Richard Coleman folded his arms and looked at her as though he had already solved the case. In his mind, the story was simple. A woman dressed too casually had somehow found her way into a space reserved for important travelers. The fact that she remained calm only seemed to irritate him more. Most people became nervous under scrutiny. Danielle did not. She stood there with the patience of someone who had spent years sitting across negotiating tables worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What nobody in that terminal knew was that Danielle Brooks was the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Global Logistics, one of the fastest-growing transportation companies in North America. Her company managed cargo networks, private aviation contracts, and international shipping routes across dozens of countries. Business magazines had featured her. Financial networks had interviewed her. Yet none of that mattered in this moment because nobody was looking for a successful executive. They were looking at a black woman in a sweater and jeans. Danielle preferred it that way. She often traveled without assistants, security teams, or luxury branding. Years earlier, she had learned something valuable. People revealed their true character when they believed status was absent. That lesson had shaped how she viewed the world. It was also the reason she occasionally visited airports, hotels, and corporate partners without announcing who she was. The reactions were always revealing. Some places treated everyone with dignity. Others did not. Richard glanced down at his tablet again. I still do not understand these travel arrangements, he said. You claim you have an important departure scheduled, yet there is no reason for someone like you to be waiting in this section. The words landed heavily. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. Danielle noticed them pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Emily Carter noticed it too. The young employee stood near a service counter, her expression growing more troubled by the minute. She had reviewed enough passenger information during her job to recognize certain names. Danielle Brooks was one of them. She could not remember where she had seen it, but the name felt familiar. Important. Significant. Emily looked toward Richard, then toward Danielle, then back toward the computer station behind her. Doubt was beginning to replace certainty. Danielle remained composed. Someone like me? She asked quietly. Richard immediately realized how his words sounded, but instead of correcting himself, he doubled down. Someone whose travel profile raises questions. Danielle nodded once. That answer told her everything she needed to know. Outside the giant windows, the evening sky deepened into shades of amber and navy. Taxiway lights flickered to life across the airfield. The distant engine noise grew louder. This time, several travelers looked up briefly before returning to the unfolding confrontation. Danielle checked the time on her phone. Right on schedule. Richard noticed the glance and smirked. You seem very confident for someone who is not going anywhere. Danielle slipped her phone back into her pocket. Confidence comes from knowing the facts, she replied. Emily felt a chill run through her. The sentence sounded less like a defense and more like a warning. And somewhere beyond the runway lights, an approaching aircraft continued its steady descent toward the airport. The aircraft noise was impossible to ignore now. Conversations around the lounge began fading as travelers glanced through the enormous windows facing the runway. Still, Richard Coleman acted as if nothing outside mattered. His focus remained fixed on Danielle Brooks. He tapped several commands into his tablet, then looked up with the expression of someone eager to prove a point. I am going to need additional verification, he announced. Until then, you will remain here. The wording sounded official, but the tone behind it carried something else entirely. Danielle noticed it. So did the people watching. A middle-aged businessman near the espresso machine frowned and slowly lowered his coffee cup. A younger traveler sitting near the charging station exchanged a look with his wife. Nobody wanted to interfere, yet nobody could ignore what was happening. Richard turned toward another security employee who had quietly approached during the exchange. Run another check, he said. There is something wrong here. The employee hesitated. Her identification already cleared twice. Richard's expression hardened. Run it again. The employee nodded reluctantly and walked away. Danielle watched the interaction without speaking. The room felt smaller now. The tension seemed to press against the glass walls of the lounge itself. Emily Carter stood frozen near her workstation. The more she listened, the less comfortable she became. Something about the situation refused to make sense. Danielle had remained polite. Her documents appeared valid. Yet Richard kept searching for reasons to justify his suspicions. Emily finally walked toward her terminal and quietly began checking internal passenger records. She told herself she was simply verifying information. In reality, she was looking for answers. Richard crossed his arms. What exactly is so important about your departure tonight? He asked. Danielle met his gaze. Business. Richard gave a short laugh. That must be some business. Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. Danielle noticed the reaction. Richard did not. Confidence had turned into arrogance. He believed the crowd supported him. In truth, the crowd was beginning to question him. Outside, runway lights stretched across the evening landscape like lines of gold. The approaching aircraft descended lower. A few travelers now pressed closer to the windows. One of them pointed toward the sky. Another pulled out a phone. Yet inside the lounge, the confrontation continued. Richard glanced toward the gathering attention and shook his head dismissively. You know, he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal. People make mistakes all the time. They end up in places they do not belong. Danielle remained perfectly still. And how do you decide who belongs? She asked. The question landed harder than Richard expected. For a brief second, he had no answer. Then he recovered. Experience. Danielle nodded slowly. Interesting. Emily's eyes widened as information appeared on her monitor. She blinked once, then twice. The name on the screen triggered immediate recognition. Multiple executive travel clearances, corporate aviation records, high-level transportation credentials. Her pulse quickened. She looked from the screen to Danielle, then toward Richard. A growing realization settled over her. The entire situation was heading in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, beyond the glass, the descending aircraft finally emerged from the darkening sky. Its landing lights burned bright against the horizon. And as its silhouette became visible, several people near the windows suddenly stopped talking altogether. The silhouette crossing the evening sky captured more attention with every passing second. Travelers drifted toward the windows as if pulled by an invisible current. Some pointed, others whispered. The aircraft was still too far away for details, but it was large enough to command attention. Inside the lounge, however, Emily Carter could barely focus on the runway anymore. Her eyes remained locked on the information glowing across her monitor. The records were unmistakable. Executive clearances, corporate aviation authorizations, international travel credentials, everything connected to one name, Danielle Brooks. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She looked up slowly. Danielle stood exactly where she had been standing the entire time, calm and composed while suspicion continued to swirl around her. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Most people would have become frustrated by now. Some would have argued. Others might have walked away. Danielle did neither. She simply waited. Emily glanced toward Richard Coleman. He was speaking again, his confidence growing louder as the situation dragged on. There are procedures for a reason, he said to nobody in particular. When something does not add up, we investigate. The statement sounded reasonable on the surface, but the room had begun to sense the difference between procedure and prejudice. A businessman near the window folded his arms. An older woman shook her head slightly. The atmosphere was shifting. Richard simply did not see it yet. Emily took a breath and stood from her workstation. Her heart pounded harder with every step she took toward him. "Richard," she said carefully. He barely looked at her. "What is it?" Emily lowered her voice. "I think there may be something you should review." Richard frowned. "I already reviewed it." "No," Emily replied. "I mean all of it." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. "I know exactly what I am doing." Emily glanced toward Danielle before speaking again. "I am not sure you do." The words landed heavily. Several nearby travelers turned toward them. Danielle remained silent. Richard's expression hardened immediately. "Return to your station." Emily hesitated. "Richard, that was not a suggestion." The young employee stopped speaking, but the concern remained visible on her face. Danielle noticed. So did the crowd. Silence settled over the lounge once again. Beyond the glass, the approaching aircraft dropped lower. Its landing lights reflected against the windows like bright stars. More passengers gathered to watch. One man quietly pulled out his phone and began recording the arrival. Another traveler squinted toward the fuselage, trying to identify the aircraft type. The growing interest outside only sharpened the tension inside. Richard turned back toward Danielle. "You seem remarkably unconcerned." Danielle offered a faint smile. "Should I be concerned?" Richard took a step closer. "Most people would be." Danielle's expression never changed. "Most people know the truth eventually catches up." The answer lingered in the air. Emily looked back toward her monitor one final time. Then she looked at the aircraft beyond the glass. Suddenly something connected in her mind. Her eyes widened. The timing, the travel records, the aviation authorizations, the confidence. One realization led directly to another. She whispered a single sentence under her breath. "Oh no." Outside, the aircraft's wheels lowered into position. Inside, the first cracks in Richard Coleman's certainty had finally begun to appear. The wheels touched the runway with a distant puff of white vapor, and for a moment the entire wall of windows seemed to pull every eye in the lounge toward the same point. Conversation stopped. Even the people who had tried to ignore the situation could not help looking outside. The aircraft rolled across the tarmac with smooth precision, its landing lights cutting through the deepening evening. Emily Carter stared through the glass, then back at Danielle Brooks, then back at the aircraft again. The pieces were falling into place faster now. Richard Coleman noticed the growing attention and frowned. He disliked losing control of a situation. "Everyone seems very interested in that airplane," he said dismissively. "Let us stay focused on the matter at hand." Danielle said nothing. Her calm only seemed to frustrate him further. Richard stepped closer and lowered his voice, though not enough to keep nearby travelers from hearing. "You know what I think?" he asked. Danielle looked at him patiently. "I think people like you count on others being afraid to ask questions." The words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Several travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emily felt her stomach drop. There it was, the line that transformed suspicion into something else entirely. Richard apparently did not realize how many people had heard him. Danielle remained composed, but something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger, not surprise, recognition. She had heard variations of the same sentence before. Years ago, when she was 23, she stood inside a small regional airport carrying a laptop bag and a dream she had not yet built into reality. She remembered presenting her boarding pass to an employee who looked at her, then looked at the ticket, then looked at her again. The employee had asked whether she was certain she belonged in the executive boarding lane. Danielle remembered the embarrassment. She remembered the silence from people nearby who had watched without speaking. Most of all, she remembered promising herself that success would never change her dignity. The memory faded. The present returned. Richard was still talking. "People do not just walk around with access to private aviation," he said. "That is not how the real world works." A few passengers visibly cringed at the comment. Danielle folded her hands calmly. "Is that what you believe?" she asked. Richard nodded confidently. "I believe experience matters." Emily nearly interrupted him. The records on her screen told a completely different story. Yet before she could speak, another traveler near the windows suddenly pointed toward the aircraft. "Wait a second," the man said. Several people leaned closer to the glass. The jet had turned slowly while taxiing, exposing more of its fuselage beneath the airport lights. Large lettering stretched across the side of the aircraft. The distance still made it difficult to read clearly, but the reaction among the observers was immediate. Something about it had captured their attention. Danielle glanced at her phone. A single message appeared on the screen. "Arrival confirmed." She read it, locked the device, and slipped it back into her pocket. Richard noticed the movement. "Still confident?" he asked with a smirk. Danielle finally smiled. It was small, controlled, certain. "More than ever," she replied. And as the aircraft continued taxiing closer to the terminal, the first visible cracks in Richard Coleman's version of reality began spreading through the room. The crowd near the windows continued to grow. What had started as quiet curiosity was becoming focused attention. Travelers who had been checking messages moments earlier were now standing shoulder to shoulder, staring across the airfield. The aircraft moved steadily along the taxiway beneath the glow of runway lights, its polished exterior reflecting streaks of gold and white. Inside the lounge, Richard Coleman could feel the atmosphere changing, even if he did not fully understand why. His confidence remained intact, but it was no longer being echoed by the people around him. Danielle Brooks noticed the shift immediately. The room had begun asking questions Richard was not prepared to answer. She calmly removed her phone once more and opened a contact labeled Ava Reynolds. The call connected almost instantly. "Everything is in position," Ava said. Her voice was calm, professional, and prepared. Danielle looked through the glass toward the aircraft. "Good," she replied. "Tell them we are ready." That was all she said. No explanation. No argument. No attempt to defend herself. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Richard watched the exchange carefully. "Calling someone to fix this?" he asked. Danielle met his gaze. "No, I am calling someone who already knows the truth." The answer unsettled him more than he expected. Emily Carter stood nearby, listening carefully. She had already seen enough information to know Danielle was not who Richard believed she was. The records on her screen had confirmed it. Executive travel status, corporate aviation credentials, special clearances that ordinary passengers never received. Emily wanted to speak up again, but she could sense the moment approaching. Something larger than a routine misunderstanding was unfolding. A businessman near the windows suddenly pointed toward the aircraft again. "You can read it now," he said. Several travelers leaned closer to the glass. The jet had moved nearer to the terminal, and the lettering along the fuselage was becoming visible beneath the airport lights. A murmur spread through the crowd. One person squinted. Another pulled out a phone and zoomed in. Richard glanced toward the windows, but quickly returned his attention to Danielle. "You still have not explained your situation," he said. Danielle smiled faintly. "I do not owe an explanation to someone who never asked for facts." The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even Richard seemed unsure how to respond. The aircraft continued moving slowly across the field. The closer it came, the more conversations stopped. People were no longer watching because they were curious. They were watching because they sensed a revelation approaching. Emily looked toward the jet one more time and felt certainty replace doubt. She knew exactly what she was seeing now. Her eyes widened. Across the lounge, a traveler suddenly whispered, "Wait a minute. I know that company." Another traveler nodded. "So do I." The reaction spread quickly. Danielle remained perfectly calm, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to convince anyone. Outside the windows, the truth was already rolling toward the terminal on its own schedule, and every passing second brought it closer. The aircraft finally turned broadside beneath the terminal lights, and the reaction inside the lounge was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones rose into the air. Travelers pressed closer to the windows. What had been distant speculation became undeniable reality. The lettering across the fuselage was now fully visible. Brooks Global. The name stretched across the side of the jet in bold, dark lettering that reflected against the polished metal exterior. A businessman near the glass stared in disbelief. "No way," he whispered. Another traveler looked from the aircraft to Danielle Brooks and back again. "That is her company." The realization moved through the lounge like an electric current. Emily Carter closed her eyes for a brief second. Everything she had suspected was now standing on the runway for everyone to see. Richard Coleman remained frozen. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion, then from confusion to concern. He looked toward the jet, then toward Danielle, then back toward the jet again. The certainty that had carried him through the last 30 minutes was beginning to disappear. Danielle stood calmly with her hands folded in front of her. She had not moved. She had not argued. She had not demanded respect. The truth had arrived on its own. Outside, airport ground personnel were already positioning vehicles around the aircraft. The operation moved with the precision of a team following a well-rehearsed plan. Several travelers continued recording through the glass. Others simply stared. One woman shook her head slowly. "He stopped the wrong person," she said quietly. Richard swallowed hard. "That does not prove anything," he replied, though his voice lacked the conviction it once carried. The statement sounded weak even to him. Emily finally stepped forward. "Actually, it proves quite a lot." Every eye turned toward her. Richard's face tightened. "Emily." But she continued. "I checked the records." The room became completely silent. Her executive travel credentials are legitimate. Her aviation clearances are legitimate. Everything checked out long before this conversation started. Richard said nothing. Emily looked directly at him. "You never had a documentation problem." The words landed with devastating precision. A few travelers exchanged knowing looks. Others nodded quietly. Danielle remained composed. Richard searched for a response, but could not find one. Outside the window, a set of black vehicles approached the aircraft. Airport personnel moved into position. The scene unfolding on the runway looked less like the arrival of a passenger and more like the arrival of someone important. Danielle finally glanced toward Richard. Her voice was calm, measured, unshaken. "You spent all this time questioning whether I belonged here." Richard looked at her, but could not speak. Danielle continued. "You never asked the one question that mattered." The room held its breath. "Which question?" Richard asked. Danielle turned slightly toward the window where the Brooks Global aircraft sat illuminated beneath the airport lights. Who was actually arriving? The silence that followed felt enormous. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Beyond the glass, the aircraft door began to open. And for the first time that evening, Richard Coleman looked genuinely afraid of what was coming next. The aircraft door swung open beneath the glow of the airport floodlights, and every conversation inside the lounge disappeared. The silence was so complete that even the distant hum of ground equipment seemed louder. Travelers pressed closer to the glass. Phones remained raised. Eyes stayed fixed on the runway. A group of airport executives emerged from a nearby vehicle and walked directly toward the aircraft with the urgency of people who had suddenly realized they were late. Richard Coleman watched the scene unfold, his expression tightening with every passing second. Nothing about this looked ordinary. Nothing about it resembled the arrival of a routine passenger. Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she was, calm and unshaken. She looked less like someone being questioned and more like someone waiting for a meeting to begin. Emily Carter stood beside her workstation, unable to look away. The records had already told her the truth. Now the entire airport was about to see it. Outside, one of the executives spoke briefly into a radio before turning toward the terminal building. Another checked a tablet and immediately changed direction toward the VIP entrance. Their movements carried a sense of urgency that spread through the crowd. Richard noticed it too. He looked toward Danielle. What exactly is going on? The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. Danielle glanced toward the runway. The facts are catching up. The answer landed heavily. Several travelers nodded quietly. They had witnessed the entire exchange. They had heard every assumption, every accusation, every dismissive comment disguised as procedure. And now the atmosphere had completely reversed. A businessman near the windows shook his head. This is not ending the way he thought it would. Another traveler replied, not even close. Moments later, the automatic doors at the far end of the lounge opened. Two senior airport administrators entered quickly, scanning the room. The instant their eyes landed on Danielle Brooks, both of them changed direction and walked straight toward her. The reaction was immediate. Richard's face lost color. Emily inhaled sharply. The crowd grew silent once again. One administrator extended his hand. Ms. Brooks, I sincerely apologize for the delay. The other added, we were informed about the situation moments ago. Danielle shook their hands politely. I appreciate you coming. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. Travelers who had been uncertain before now understood exactly what they were witnessing. The executives were not greeting an ordinary passenger. They were greeting someone whose presence carried significance far beyond the terminal walls. Richard stood motionless. His tablet remained in his hand, but it no longer looked like a source of authority. It looked like a shield that had suddenly become useless. One of the administrators finally turned toward him. Mr. Coleman, he said evenly, we will need to discuss this incident immediately. The words were professional, but their meaning was unmistakable. Richard opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. There was nothing left to argue. Too many witnesses had seen what happened. Too many facts had emerged. The assumptions that had seemed so certain 30 minutes earlier were now collapsing in front of everyone. Danielle looked around the lounge. The same people who had watched silently before were now watching for a different reason. The balance of power had shifted completely, and for the first time all evening, Richard Coleman realized that the person he had spent so long questioning had never needed to prove anything at all. The lounge remained silent long after the airport administrators arrived. The tension that had dominated the room for nearly an hour had vanished, replaced by something far heavier. Perspective. Travelers who had watched the confrontation unfold now understood what they had really witnessed. It had never been a problem with documentation. It had never been a problem with procedure. It had been a problem with assumptions. Danielle Brooks stood calmly beside the windows overlooking the runway. Beyond the glass, the Brooks Global aircraft rested beneath the lights, a quiet reminder that facts do not need permission to exist. One of the administrators continued speaking with Richard Coleman a short distance away. Their conversation remained professional, but the outcome was obvious. Richard no longer looked like the person who had controlled the room earlier. His shoulders had lowered. His confidence had disappeared. The certainty that had fueled every accusation had dissolved under the weight of reality. Emily Carter watched everything unfold. She felt relief, but also something deeper. Validation. She had trusted her instincts when something felt wrong. She had chosen facts over assumptions. Danielle noticed her standing nearby and walked over. Thank you, Danielle said. Emily blinked in surprise. For what? Danielle smiled. For paying attention when everyone else was comfortable accepting the easy explanation. Emily looked down briefly. I almost stayed quiet. Danielle nodded. Almost is not the same as actually staying quiet. The words settled into Emily's mind. Nearby travelers overheard the exchange and exchanged thoughtful looks. A businessman who had watched the entire incident stepped forward. Ma'am, he said respectfully, You handled that with more patience than most people could. Danielle smiled politely. Anger changes very few minds. Truth does the work eventually. Several people nodded. The statement felt larger than the moment itself. Outside, airport crews continued moving around the aircraft. Inside, the administrators finished their discussion with Richard and approached Danielle once more. They offered another apology and assured her the incident would be formally reviewed. Danielle listened politely. Then she surprised them. Make sure the review focuses on the process, not just the person, she said. If one assumption can create this situation, then the system needs to learn from it. The administrators exchanged glances and nodded. They understood exactly what she meant. The room grew quiet again. Danielle looked around the lounge one final time. The same travelers who had watched her be questioned were now looking at her differently. Not because of the aircraft. Not because of her company. Not because of her success. They were looking at her differently because they had witnessed her character. She never shouted. She never demanded special treatment. She simply refused to surrender her dignity. Danielle picked up her bag and turned toward the exit that would lead her to the next stage of her journey. Before leaving, she paused and looked back once more. The problem was never that you did not know who I was, she said calmly. The problem was how you treated someone you believed was nobody. Nobody spoke. They did not need to. The lesson had already landed. Danielle continued toward the doors as the evening lights reflected across the polished floor. Behind her, the lounge remained silent. Ahead of her, another destination waited. And in the minds of everyone who witnessed that evening, one truth remained. Real power does not announce itself. It reveals the character of everyone around it.